Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome, listeners, to Operation Jericho Project Radio, where we're going to begin to blow the horns on truth in order to bring down the walls of government-controlled education system. Here you will get the hardcore truth about what is really happening to our children in the government indoctrination system we call public education, with information you're not going to hear anywhere else, and there's nothing PC about our presentations. It's time to take off the gloves and expose the evil agendas that are being thrust on our children in the name of education. Parents, this is to you. You believe that you're sending your children off on that yellow school bus to learn the 3 R's, but that's not the reality of what they're learning. They're really learning earth worship, animal rights over human rights, evolution, anti-Christian bias, global warming, climate change, sustainability, social justice, equity, diversity. These are all socialist goals. And worst of all, sex ed, alcohol ed, drug ed, and death ed. Sexualization, homosexualization, secular humanism, and Islamization over Christianity. Wake up, parents. Our nation's children have been through values clarification, outcome-based education, mastery learning, no child left behind, race to the top, and now Common Core, just another name for the same agenda. These are all federal programs that have failed our children. Our mission is to bring you more than the problems here at Operation Jericho Project Radio. We will talk about the solutions and alternatives as well. We believe it's time to activate pastors and Christians, leaders, parents, grandparents, community businesses to step forward to stand in the gap for our nation's children and help Operation Jericho Project rescue the children from the indoctrination of so-called public education. We encourage you to visit our website at www.operationjerichoproject.com to follow the show topics and be sure to listen to the podcast. We welcome you today, and we thank you for joining us. I'm your host and Operation Jericho Project founder, Christina Mikas, and my co-host, Angela Bean, and our special guest today is Beverly Eakman, author and woman accomplished in so many things, but I'm going to let Angela do the honors of introducing our guest, Beverly Eakman. Welcome, Angela.
Hi, Christina. I am so excited about our show today because as our listeners should know, the mission of Operation Jericho Radio is to help our parents understand what their children are being exposed to in the government-controlled schools. And we've had a couple of shows where we've discussed the curriculum and Common Core and those kind of topics. But today's topic should be of great concern to all of us, even if we don't currently have children in the system. We're going to discuss how our children are being used in our government-controlled schools to collect information on our families. And if you've been following the Common Core debate, you've already become aware of data mining. And a lot of citizens who have been working with their legislators to get out from under Common Core, they became a data mining of our children for the very first time. But as our guest today will explain, this data mining is not new to our schools. In fact, it's been going on for decades. And Beverly Eakman is just the perfect person to have on our program today to discuss these things. She is a veteran of some 750 radio and TV talk shows and has written over 300 columns for major publications addressing these concerns. She has been called to testify on education panels against such topics as child drugging of, quote, naughty pupils for their petty offenses. She has been, she's worked for the federal government. She's written many books. Her most recently released book is Agenda Games. which, by the way, is a book that I started reading and highlighting, but it discovered all the pages were yellow because she doesn't waste a single word in her books. Everything is important. Her 1998 international award-winning bestseller was Cloning of the American Mind, The Eradication of Morality Through Education. And currently, Beverly will tell us that this book is in the editorial process of a massive update to get it current with today's issues, and is set for reissue later this year. And the title will be Cloning of the American Mind, 15 years later. So, Beverly, welcome to our show. I just touched briefly on your bio, but there's so much more about you and your work. Can you start off by telling us about your background and how you became known as the education whistleblower?
Okay, it's a pleasure to be on your show. Your work is so important. Actually, my most recent publication that was published in March is Pushback, How to Take a Stand Against Groupthink, Bullies, Agitators, and Professional Manipulators. And that's a how-to for parents and concerned citizens that are getting run over by facilitators that come into the community and start this consensus-building process. And, you know you're being taken, but you don't know how to stop the process and shut it down. And a New York house came to me with a request to get that going because I was teaching it in seminars anyway. So that's the most recent one, and then before that was Agenda Games, and before that was Cloning the American Mind, which is currently in update, as you said. I started really as a high school, junior high and high school teacher back in the late 60s, 68, 69, and then in the early 70s. And I escaped that environment because I sort of realized what was going on, but not completely. It just hit me wrong. And also my teacher education preparation classes seem to be emphasizing preventative psychology instead of reading, writing, and arithmetic, the basics. They didn't care whether we knew the value of X. They didn't care whether we knew our subject at all. They were really hot on psychology, and I thought, well, that's really odd. But, you're 19 years old, and you're out of the nest for the first time, and you don't quite get it. But after I was in the classroom for a few years, I did get it, and then when I came back to my home base, which is Washington, D.C., I thought I was out of education. I started working for the federal government in several capacities, among them the Bicentennial Commission of the U.S. Constitution under Chief Justice Warren Burger, who stepped down from the court to chair that organization. And they were fairly conservative. They were fairly level-headed. And somehow or another, I got dragged back into education via a friend that noticed somebody on Capitol Hill that had just found a bunch of so-called assessment tests, which we call standardized tests, and they were full of psychology questions passed off as academics, and she turned them upside down on Senator Arlen Specter's desk. She came to the Capitol from Pennsylvania and just turned them upside down and says, what's going on here? And he couldn't very well point the finger at his own state, so he started doing some looking around. I got involved in it, and pretty soon I was receiving letters between the state education agency and the local education agency proving that the feds essentially were behind both. So that's kind of what started me off in a very short explanation.
So, Beverly, the topic today, data collecting. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of the data collecting, how it got started, when did the computer storage come on board, and what should parents know about what kind of data is being collected on their families?
Well, there is a big problem at this point. When you talk about collecting data, the average parent today, as opposed to even 15 years ago, does not get his antenna, in a huff about it, because as New York Magazine said in 2013, privacy jumped the shark, as he put it.
Yeah.
And what happened is all these television shows and radio shows kept coming on the air, hyping those private, intimate details of a person's life, and suddenly all this stuff was marketed as cool, quote, unquote. And with that, the people that are young parents today don't get as upset about data collection. They don't understand why they should be worried about it as much. I mean, they're putting out their Social Security number on warranty cards, for heaven's sakes. And so people who do that are not connecting with what's going on. But the real bottom line to it is they're not just collecting Social Security numbers. Everything is interconnected because everything is computerized. And these children are being asked personal questions and questions about their family and parents and religion and everything else. And when you start connecting the various databases together, you wind up with, guess what, dossiers. This is not what the founding fathers had in mind.
Beverly,
excuse
me, data mining. We say data mining, and we think,
right,
like
and that
became
the popular term after 2001. The attacks. People found out about data mining, and there was a flap for a while. And then, of course, Edward Snowden came along in 2013, and there was another flap. But not as much as a flap as there would have been 40 years ago.
Right.
I mean, we wouldn't have put up with this 40 years ago.
Well, now they're putting everything out on Facebook and Twitter, and everybody's putting their whole life on Facebook, so it doesn't register, like you said, for them that this is something wrong. And yet the data mining, the assessing and everything that's being done of these children is to get into the personal psychological part of their minds. Your family,
if you want the technical term for it. They want into the belief system, and if you don't think they know what they're doing, I went into a back door. I lucked into a back door, accidentally, of the National Center for Education Statistics, which is probably the most important sub-agency of the Department of Education. And I found all these references to assessment tests. They changed cognitive testing and standardized testing to assessment tests, or just to assessments. And they took the word test out because they could have been legally liable for misrepresentation. But they knew what they were doing. And I have quotes here from them, 5 of them, 5 different sources that the National Center for Education Statistics collated, and, I'll just let you listen to them if you like, and you can see that they know what they were doing. One of them is, while the words test and assessment cannot be reliably distinguished technically, the difference is of symbolic importance. A test typically stands for traditional, standardized, developmental, and pre-academic measures, while the term assessment refers more to developmentally appropriate procedures and observing young children. Whole different thing. And here's another one. Assessment is the process of gathering information about children to make decisions about their education. And later on they tell you what those decisions involve, which are mostly psychological. Teachers obtain useful information about children's knowledge, skills, and progress by observing, documenting, and reviewing children's work and families over time and families. Assessment is the process of observing and recording and documenting. Assessment involves the multiple steps of collecting data on a child's development. An assessment is any systematic procedure for obtaining information from tests and other sources that can be used to draw information about people, objects, or programs. When you get into those other sources and see where they're getting those other sources, that's when the American people should go ballistic.
Well, what are some of those other sources, Beverly? Because I know I hit on a survey a couple of months ago called the Positive Behavior Intervention and Support Survey, and this is done nationwide. Every school in America is implementing this program, and the questions that are asked on this are of very personal nature. Have you heard of that particular survey?
That particular name for it, no, but the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study includes a birth cohort. There's a restricted use data file and an electronic code book. That's their words, not mine. And a social rating scale. That's their words, not mine. Social rating skill scale. That's their words, not mine. There's early childhood study that asks questions of a father. This is for pre-education, the early education programs that they're trying to get all kids into as early as possible so that toddlers are included. Do you or your spouse or partner, notice that, have arguments about the following? Would you say often, sometimes, hardly ever, or never? And then they give you a lot of choices, chores and responsibilities, your children, et cetera, et cetera. Couples deal with serious disagreements in different ways. When you have a serious disagreement with your spouse or partner, how often do you do the following? Keep your opinions to yourself. Discuss your disagreements calmly, and so forth and so on. And then there's parent-child interactions that's videotaped and coded for behaviors. And then, how about this question? When did you first hold your child? Within an hour after delivery, the day of delivery, but more than an hour, 1 day after birth, 2 or 3 days after birth, 4 to 7 days after. What in the world business is it of our government to be doing this?
Now, who fills out that survey? Is that sent home to the parent?
No, this is the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study put out by the Education Information Management Advisory Consortium Assessment Task Force, and that is, again, a sub-agency of the U.S. Department of Education. The real people behind it are the Council of Chief State School Officers, which more or less started out as a quasi-federally funded agency and ended up as a fully federal funded agency. And their main task back in 1976 was interactive, computer-based tasks to start that ball rolling and to get all of the local education agencies to make their computer systems compatible with federal ones. People had no clue what they were doing or that they existed, but they did it. And, of course, if any state balked or any local education agency balked, they were independent then, more or less. Of course, 1976 was when, the U.S. Department of Education became a cabinet-level agency on its own right. So since they started this process in 1974, a lot of the local and state education agencies balked. And if they balked, the Council of Chief State School Officers says, well, why are you balking? And they say, we can't afford this. We can't do this. We lend you the money. We happy to give it to you. We'd be happy to help you. And that was when the local state education agencies got hooked in to the federal government. Pretty soon, they had to have that money. They'd spend it for this, that, and the other, including gym towels. And, there was no way that it wouldn't be seen by the average community that something was missing if they suddenly stopped that gravy train coming. So this test this study that I just explained to you, the birth cohort and the social rating scale with these types of really, really personal questions, which, by the way, has an OMB number attached. Do you know what that is? Office of Management and Budget. That's federal.
Yes.
I used to put those same numbers on there at the Justice Department.
So
this is serious stuff. People are not getting it.
They're not, and that's why we need to break it down, to where they understand that these assessments, you hear assessments now saying, well, we want to assess the child in their educational aptitude. It has zero to do with educational aptitude and has everything to do with changing the psychology of the child.
That's exactly. In my coursework in educational psychology, when I was a college student, that didn't sound right to me. That's what first started me off. And then here I go and see this stuff later on. And it's actually when I said, just a second. When I said these first, the name of this, excuse me.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
That's all right, Henry. You can hear it again.
All right.
All right.
When I first gave you the name of this organization that was putting these out, the Educational Information Management Advisory Consortium Assessment Task Force, that's the one that has the OMB number on it, but it goes by the call letters ECLS. So that's Early Childhood Longitudinal Study, and that's been around for a long time. The preschool year and then on into high school and then on into the workforce. These children are being tracked on into adulthood and their first employment, and they keep getting follow-up surveys. One guy in the Washington Post couldn't understand why he kept getting follow-up surveys. And he didn't know that they were longitudinal studies. He actually didn't know that, and I had to call him and inform him that his whole article was a longitudinal study. And then he got it, but he thought that he was just getting surveys from the university where he had attended, which had passed along his high school survey from when he was 16 years old.
Well, that's how they plan to track them, and then not only track them, but to see where they are, how effective their indoctrination has been, and if it's not effective, then we need to double down on the indoctrination.
Then they change the curriculum. That's when curriculum is being changed, and when you talk about Common Core, that's the last nail in the coffin. I mean, they've been talking about getting involved in curriculum for years, but it's against the law, and there is a particular law, a public law against it, and has been for a very, very long time. And they've been trying to circumvent it. A lot of times they just circumvent it and, ignore figure that the results, they're not going to get in too much trouble. Let's just put it that way. And they don't. More and more they are not getting in trouble for it. But now, with the Obama administration, they have circumvented it completely. In fact, they've watered down the Family Education Rights Privacy Act in 2012 so that people really can't sue on that basis, or if they do try to sue, they the kids are graduated by the time the suit goes to court, and they give it up.
Really? Almost a moot point. Let's
exactly.
explain a little bit about what you mean, Beverly, about effective domain and how they're using that to affect the child from classic learning to a new focus on like attitudes and beliefs. This goes back to the psychology change.
Exactly, the emphasis on psychology. It's really preventive psychology. Just keep that word in mind. Affective as opposed to effective. Affective means to deal with the emotions and feelings. That's really what it means. And it goes back to what is a field, believe it or not, called evolutionary psychology. You want to talk about evolution in its worst context, then evolutionary psychology is it. Dr. Paul Propano, who was the editor of evolutionary biology way back in 1929, I think, and he said all the educational system should be a sieve through which all the children of a country are passed. It is very desirable that no child escape inspection, unquote. That changed everything. I mean, if it doesn't give you the shivers, it should. Inspection under Common Core is the final nail in the coffin, then, for anything resembling a common body of knowledge, as we once understood the term. The whole purpose of public education originally was to create a common body of knowledge so that newcomers to our shores, which we fully expected, would come in waves, and it did, would assimilate. Today's children, of course, they don't care if they assimilate or not, and the government doesn't care if they assimilate or not. In fact, if they can put them at each other's throats, so much the better. So preventive psychology is the goal of this surreptitious mental health screening and psychologized curriculum, as I call it, that is changing or deculturizing the nation so that it no longer will adhere to the beliefs that the founding fathers had in the beginning about inalienable rights and unalienable rights and private property, right to private property, the right to free speech, and all of these things that we talked about back when Thomas Jefferson and Monroe and so forth and Benjamin Franklin and everything were talking about creating a new nation and a constitution that was unique, and the country and a nation that was unique and not based on what old world philosophies we had about regimentation and control under a government. That was the whole point of this exercise of America, was to divest ourselves of this regimentation and control, and the fact to establish self-determination. And, just because your father was a carpenter didn't mean you had to be a carpenter. You could be something else, and so forth and so on. That was not true of most of the old world. But it was going to be true here. It was going to be a difference here. So we had self-determination, and that was part of the deal. Well, now we're reverting. We're reverting back to the idea that man needs to be regimented and controlled and scared half his wits to avoid hurting himself and others. How many times have you heard that? He's a danger to himself and others. That's psychology.
Well, Beverly, you've talked about how the curriculum changes in the psychologized classroom has really been intended to more or less separate the child from their support base of the family.
Right.
And the way I hear you describe it, it sounds just like the complaints I'm hearing from parents about the Common Core math. Can you explain how curriculum can do this?
Well, first of all, curriculum is being changed in such a way that it incorporates an element of psychology no matter which subject you're talking about. And then, of course, it includes a lot of other subjects. I mean, social studies used to be history, geography, language, and, other things. But now we have social studies. Social studies is a relatively new thing. It isn't brand new to us, but in the 50s, it became a new thing, a new way to bring psychology into it. And the problem is that assessments are doing is they're based on what's known as a predictive algorithm. And an algorithm simply means a mathematical formula against which everything is matched and the numbers are crunched, so to speak. And so all of this personal information goes into a predictive algorithm, which means it says what you will probably do given a built-in hypothetical scenario, say 5 years, 2 years, 10 years, whatever, down the road. So they ask questions about parents and their beliefs so that they can gauge how different the children's beliefs based on the current curriculum. If it is very different, like, say, the global warming business is very different from what the parents believe, then that's good news for them, and they don't have to mess with the curriculum too much more than they already have. If, on the other hand, it hasn't changed and most of the children don't buy into the psychological fads and the multiculturalism fad, and I don't mean just by that, respecting other cultures. We've always respected other cultures. But all the things that go along with it, all the psychology that goes along with it, then they need to change the curriculum and make it harder hitting. And by analyzing, first they analyze group trends, but they can also go down to the individual because, as I have said in numerous speeches around the country, I show exactly how the states serve as the fall guys for individually identifying every child. And then they match it with a Social Security number. So there's no way that if they say it's confidential, and it is, confidential in a legal sense means need to know.
Right.
Well, who decides who needs to know? And apparently the parent doesn't need to know.
Well, Beverly, in case parents are out there thinking, oh, they are just talking nonsense, this is not going on in my school, I can tell you that in Georgia, I mentioned the Positive Behavioral Intervention and Support Program. Those, if you go to the website that's linked on our radio page, you'll find your child's school report, and these questions are being asked of your children. Many of the questions are incriminating your child in illegal behavior, drinking alcohol, smoking, using drugs, bringing a gun to school, being a member of a gang, and then it's also sharing information about the family behavior and what have you. But in Georgia, when we had a Common Core withdrawal bill moved through our legislature, when it was finally rewritten and released in February, 10 pages of this bill addressed privacy issues. And the bill actually ended up shining the light on we are collecting private and confidential and personally identifiable data, and we will not share this information with anybody unless we have a contract with an education agency or unless the federal government makes us.
Okay, that is exactly right. And here's the kind of questions children get. I mean, I was giving you questions that the adults were getting when they take their kids to an early childhood education thing, but here's the kind of things that the children are getting, and they're asked 2 or 3 different ways so that they'll get a straight answer. I often wish I were someone else, or I get upset easily at home, and the child is to put A, very true of me, B, mostly true of me, C, mostly untrue of me, D, very untrue of me. You're asked to sit at a table with retarded students. In this situation, I would feel A, very comfortable, B, comfortable, C, slightly uncomfortable, D, very uncomfortable. There's a secret club at school called the Midnight Artists. They go around late at night and paint funny sayings on buildings. A student is asked to join the club. In this situation, I would join the club when I knew. A, my best friend had asked me to join. B, the most popular students were in the club. C, my parents would ground me if they found out I joined. Now, there's an interesting one. Well, okay, what is the preferred answer? And when you find, if you can find, I was lucky I could find, the scoring mechanism and the interpretive literature to how they wanted the questions, the preferred answer. There was no right or wrong, but there was preferred answers. Guess which one of that last batch? My best friend asked me to join. The most popular students were in the club. My parents would ground me if they found out I joined. Guess which is the preferred answer? Just take a guess.
The popular student.
The popular student. Cause the popular student?
Right. The most popular students were in the club. And that is because one of the goals of education now is, will the child conform to group goals? Here is what the interpretive literature to that test said. This one happened to be Pennsylvania again, but there's another one for Michigan and so on that says roughly the same thing. What is the child's locus of control? It means who is controlling the child? The parent, society, his peers, and of course we all know that they prefer his peers to be in control. Is the child externally or intrinsically motivated? Meaning, does he pretty much depend on himself, or does he motivate himself, or does he need an external motivator? Is the child amenable to change? In other words, will he change easily, like a sponge, or does he really need a lot of incentive to do it? Will the child conform to group goals, which you just talked about? Does the child willingly receive stimuli? When he turns on those TV shows, is he easily receiving the messages, the underlying messages of the show or not? And that goes for curriculum too, by the way. Will the child comply with authority figures? And when you look down there, the authority figures are supposed to be his peers, not his parents.
The whole goal is to remove the parents and replace it with the peers.
Exactly. So that is how they're doing it. They want the kids to be, this generation gap thing did not really appear until they made it appear. Until they made children
into their
own little...
Go ahead, Barry. But they've actually put this into their brains so that they actually now believe this, that parents don't know anything. We're all, too stupid and we're too old and we're too this. And
right.
Again, it's indoctrination against parental authority.
And the rationale is, your parents are from a different generation, Johnny. You can make up your own mind. It's a different take on think for yourself. It's an entirely different take because really they don't want you to think for yourself. They want you to think like your peers think. That's what they're really telling you.
And then they have to deculturize you too. I mean, that's another thing. As they're doing this whole process, they have to deculturalize everybody.
Yes.
So that
now,
they
deculturalization is a whole other story. In fact, the book Cloning of the American Mind, instead of being subtitled Eradication of Morality Through Education, which was the first version, is now Deculturalization of the Nation through Education. So that is the same steps that Stalin took. He said
Correct.
that deculturization of the target country that they were infiltrating was the most important thing. So we're watching this in progress, but most parents never studied anything about Marxism, and we really should have. We should have studied Marxism, because if we don't study what the bad guys said or what our enemies were saying, I mean, just like we did Hitler and so on, then we don't know what to do about it. We don't know what we're fighting. You have to know your enemy.
Our kids don't even know who Hitler was. I mean, seriously, this is the problem. They don't understand communism and the things that came before. So when we say that Common Core is communist core, and this agenda, I don't care what ism you want to put into it, whether it's Marxism, Nazism, communism, ism, it's an ism. It is not American. It is an agenda that is based on, let's say communism. Let's just throw them all into one. They're pretty much all these. They're the same.
Yeah, they're pretty much all Marxism. The biggest difference between Nazism, I mean, because they like to call Nazism right wing, so they like to call conservative right wing, and communism, which they call left wing, and that's not so bad supposedly. There is a difference. The Nazis believed just in pretty much standing their enemies against the wall and shooting them, But the Marxists, especially beginning with Stalin, believed in infiltration and doing it slowly. The proverbial frog in the pot thing, where you don't know what's hit you until it's too late. And that's where we are. That's really where we are. We're really, if we think that, and like so many say, and unfortunately Reagan made the statement too, that we won the Cold War, we lost it. Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, see, Beverly, what they're using are code words for all of this that are very deceptive to parents. We're going to design career pathways for your children, and we will make sure your child is on a career pathway to college and career readiness and success. Career pathways are not selected by the student. They're
not really, not unless they have the politically correct mindset. Your career path will be diverted, especially if you want some kind of position that might lead to leadership and, people listening to you in a more not necessarily political way, but, say journalism, that's people listening to you. Teachers, that's people listening to you. You will not get there if you have politically incorrect viewpoints. And now they're not going to hold your family necessarily over your head unless your family becomes a pain in the royal derriere. If your family becomes a pain in the royal derriere, then they will hold it over your head. But if not, then if the child is very different and holds different views from the parent, they rank that as a success. And it's very interesting if you read the psychology literature on education, which I did collate some of the more recent comments from that, what they are getting at. There's a fellow, if you haven't read it, one of the most revealing ones is Chris Mooney's book, The Republican Brain. Chris Mooney, Mooney, The Republican Brain. He doesn't mean Republican just as Republican Party. He means it as conservatives, traditionalists, constitutionalists, independents, evangelical Christians in particular. To Mooney and a long list of like-minded colleagues, and I list bunches of them, anyone falling into these categories of, constitutionalist, traditionalist, and conservative, and so forth, is closed-minded, resistant to change, rigid and intolerant, whereas liberals are characterized as open, optimistic, and even courageous. American ideals like self-sufficiency, self-reliance, and self-determination are now interpreted as signs of derangement.
Mental illness.
Individualists are tagged as loners, whom are supposed to equate with bizarre thoughts and behaviors, a danger to themselves and others. A Canadian professor of psychology that's right with this Chris Mooney guy, Robert Altemeyer, has even developed a right-wing authoritarian scale, RWA scale, drawn from mental health screening instruments. Altemeyer's work attempts to detect individuals harboring conservative mental illnesses. Well, I thought, where are the liberal mental illnesses, or even the atheist mental illnesses? Well, apparently he couldn't find any.
And so when
only us, and I think it was wasn't it Chester Pierce? I'm trying to remember this guy's name, and I know I have the documentation.
Yeah, that's
that said
one guy
that believes in nationalism or patriotism or whatever, they're insane, and so you've got to change their mind, and that again goes to that mental health.
These sick children need to be chaired by teachers, right? Exactly.
And they got all
sick children, as they put it, and their parents.
Yeah.
But he got his ideas, Brock Chisholm. All this stuff really started at the end of World War II, and that's when they really got the leftists together. The left wing that nobody wanted to pay attention to, particularly. And when you watch, programs like the History Channel isn't always the best, but it's pretty good. And they run a series of World War II things, and it becomes very clear over time that in many of the World War II series of any kind, and I'm just citing a History Channel for one, that people at the end of World War II were exhausted with war, and one thing they didn't want to do, the men coming home, was talk about their experiences in the war, unlike ours today that want to tell every detail and how horrible it was. And I'm sure it is horrible. That's not the point. But there was a totally different mindset. The parents that came home, the GIs that came home, they did not want to talk about their experiences. They did not want to talk about the horrors of war, and they did not want their children to have to think about that sort of thing happening again. So they were kind of sitting ducks for this peace and love thing that came along in the 60s. And not standing up for their rights because, that leads to war. I mean, I know that sounds crazy, but it isn't. It does make a logical sort of sense. But that left us as sort of sitting ducks for all the stuff that came along. And then the psychologists, especially Dr. Brock Chisholm and his pal John Rawlings Reese, said, we should be forming a fifth column. Psychologists need to take the reins and cure all these sick children of morality. The idea of right and wrong is what is making neurotics out of everybody, and it's taking psychologists years to undo what parents have instilled as right and wrong. This is a quote.
Well, and this is exactly what we're seeing in the curriculum in the classrooms today that's been going on for years, is that there's no more moral absolutes. There's no rights or wrongs. Tolerance and diversity are the key words, and acceptance of whatever belief system is diametrically opposed to what your family believes. And unfortunately, our families don't realize their children's values and belief systems are being changed and altered until they
they're
become
being co-opted. Let's just say it's not even so much changed as they're co-opting before the parent gets a chance. I mean, they're starting with early childhood education. They're even drugging babies. I mean, how can a baby be suffering from a mental health issue?
Well,
I mean, unless he's being beaten,
our children,
he's not suffering from a mental health issue.
And they're drugging all of our children because there's a quote out of UNESCO, and I think it was Fitch that did this, that where children will only be able to do and think as their schoolmasters would have wished once they come out of out of school, and through diet and injections and injunctions. So in other words, through drugging and all different methods, that's how they're going to brainwash the kids into. And a lot of these ideas came from that Frankfurt School, on Marxist, communist, collectivism, all of that kind of stuff. Everything started back when. This is nothing new. But we got to understand.
No, it isn't. And people didn't, there were hints, but people didn't take them seriously. They thought they were just fringe groups, and they weren't. These guys had a lot of influence in government. I mean, Joe McCarthy, when he started his House of Un-American Activities, he was big, in that. He got it wrong a few times, and a lot of them he realized he got it wrong, and he said, okay, go your way, I'm wrong. But the biggest example would be the I Love Lucy Ricardo and her husband, Ricky Ricardo. He came from Cuba, and he stood up and he said, his wife, apparently, Lucy Ricardo, when she was a child, her father was a card-carrying communist and got her to sign a communist card, and she couldn't care less about politics. She wanted to be an actress. So she signed the stupid card, and then she married Ricky Ricardo, who was Cuban and escaped from Cuba. And so Ricky Ricardo stood up on the floor of the House Non-American Activities and said, well, my wife Lucy and I disagree about a lot of things, but not this. America gave us a chance, and we love America, and we would not do anything to hurt America, and she did not know what she was signing or care what she was signing when she did this for her father. And that was the end of it, and, they were let go. So he did, there were a few of them that got caught in the system a little bit, but he wasn't basically wrong. There was infiltration going on to beat the band in that day and time. They were grabbing hold of every publication they could and sitting on the boards, getting hold of the CEOs, and that sort of thing. And they got most of the media and the TV. They got most of Hollywood. I mean, it was a 180-degree turnabout from the patriotism that we saw in World War II.
Right. And how quickly we have changed, and people just have kind of gone along with this. It's really sad. Well, Beverly, you had mentioned in one of your lectures or interviews about the 5 steps to indoctrination that the children are going through now. What these 5 steps are. One of them you mentioned was sweeping the way, the child support base. Can you expand a little on these 5 steps to indoctrination that you see happening, and get into cognitive dissonance and the ego factor and so on?
Wow, that's a big one.
I know.
Yeah, the 5 steps of indoctrination really speak to how children are sort of swept away from their parents. And it starts off basically with sweeping away first the subject's support base, his or her intellectual and emotional life raft. Undermining parents is a favorite way of yanking the rug out from under children, and I can give you an example of that in a minute, but we'll go on to number 2 way. Bombard the subject. They call it the subject, not the child, so it can apply to anyone. The subject's senses with a steady diet of conflicting, contradictory, and confusing images and words. The major TV shows do this all the time. In order to discourage reflection, the result is a vacuum where the belief system used to be. And I can explain that later. Once the vacuum has been created, you've got number 3, leaving the subject vulnerable and impressionable. And the technical term is, if you remember from what I said a minute ago, willing to receive stimuli. Load the subject, or lead him, I should say, into the desired concepts and ideas that you really want him to have. Facilitators, clinicians, and change agents are very good at this, and at professional agitators. Then you have number 4. That leads to number 4. Then you condition the subject through repeated exposure to the desired beliefs using a wide variety of formats and activities. In other words, repeat the lies until the subject believes them. But that's where we have really fallen down. We do not, have a wide variety of formats and activities. I mean, where are billboards on the sides of buses? We don't have any. Where are, our public ads? We don't have any, on TV. We don't have any PSAs. They do. Finally, number 5, test, survey, and analyze, that's your assessment, results to ascertain whether the new beliefs have been accepted. If not, repeat the whole process. So it's not exactly indoctrination. It's not exactly brainwashing. It's psychological manipulation more than anything else. What you're really doing is you're redirecting attention and disrupting the logical thought process and then blaming the kid for not being able to follow a train of thought.
Well,
you can't follow a train of thought.
Didn't we take that away from the child with the ability of that affective domain by taking away the auditory and the visual and all of that and making them just focus on feelings, attitudes, and beliefs?
Yes, that's it. In other words, go for the gut. You go for gut reactions. You don't need to have any facts. When we used to have, years ago, do debates, for example, have debates in class and whatnot, then we had to have note cards and facts to back up whatever we said. And, of course, the one with the most facts and who presented the best logical, persuasive arguments won. Well, you're not doing that anymore. And just go for the gut, and the one that can be the most charismatic and the most have the most passionate display of ideas is the one that wins, and that's why we have Obama. He is very good at that particular thing. He makes you want, or makes people, most people, want him to succeed. That's all you need is a personality thing like that. In other words, everything's a personality cult. So I think what you need to what parents need to understand is sweeping away the subject's support base and undermining them. Okay, let's go to that's number 1 in this series of the 5 steps to indoctrination. Suppose you have a special audit an auditorium filled with kids, and you're going to try to, the topic of conversation is homosexuality. Okay, so you present a gay woman, a lesbian, on the stage, and she talks about her experiences. Or it could be prostitutes. So, have a prostitute be talking to 10-year-olds. And Johnny, sitting in the audience next to his buddy, elbows his buddy and starts giggling and making a comment about this lesbian or prostitute or whoever it is they bring in. And after class, he goes back to his room, and the teacher just comes down on him like a ton of bricks and say, "Hey, would you like somebody to call you a dumb soccer jock?" Meaning a sports, nut. And he'd go, "Well, no, of course not." Well, that's what you just did to this, homosexual person or prostitute or drug addict or whatever it is they decide to supposedly for an anti-drug thing or whatever. And you say, "Hey, Johnny, parents are from a different generation. You can think for yourself now. You don't have to go along with this kind of thinking." And and so he makes Johnny feel more important than he really is. He gives Johnny, 10-year-old Johnny, the idea that his 10-year-old thought supersedes somebody in his 30s, his parents, namely, that have more experience and maybe can guide and lead him. So he's already, and then pretty soon Johnny becomes at home very, just not paying attention to his parents and being just
argumentative, and they just become rebellious and various.
Yeah, just kind of shrugging his shoulders at what they say and being, just showing an improper attitude and disrespecting his parents, and that's where that comes from. And they think to themselves, "Whatever did we do?" Or he may say, "Why are you ruining the planet?" And they're what? Like, what? Well, that's where this comes from. So undermining parents over time with various assemblies, that's what I meant to call it when I was trying to find the word there, an assembly for a particular thing like homosexuality or drug education or whatever it is, that's an entree into sweeping away the subject's support base. Okay, so let's go to number 2. Bombard the subject's senses with a steady diet of conflicting and contradictory images and words. You get this all the time on TV. First they're saying, here's your brain on drugs, and they showed a fried egg and all that kind of stuff. But then the very next minute, you have a show that's glorifying drugs. I mean, it makes no sense. You're saying, nobody should have a gun. We need to take guns away from everybody. Nobody should be defending themselves in that way. And they actually just arrested a person in Maryland for shooting a snake. I'm not kidding. They just did that this month. What do you see the next minute? Jack Bauer. I mean,
talking about climate killing everybody.
It's not. They're showing you see one program after another showing somebody blowing away somebody else. Okay, Now let's go to number 3. Once a vacuum has been created, you leave the subject vulnerable and impressionable, and you lead him to desired ideas and concepts. Okay, after you've done all this, it's pretty easy to lead somebody into other ideas, like a third way sort of thing, so that they're, maybe not. Okay, I'm open. So that part's not so bad, except that it is when they do it, when the left does it. Then you condition the subject to repeated exposure to the desired beliefs. Okay, your global warming thing. Mm-hmm. You don't ever call it a theory, for one thing. You never use that term, theory. Here's one theory, but here's the other theory. Or an evolution or anything else. You never call, here's how, maybe we're going to eventually not have an appendix anymore because we don't need an appendix in our bodies. Okay, maybe that part is evolutionary, but that doesn't mean that God didn't create man. That doesn't mean He didn't create the earth. That does, they go too far. They go this extra bit that the kids buy into, because by that time they can easily be conditioned into anything, or the hookup culture. Though that's just going to be swell. Girls have the same desires as guys. Well, yeah. How well has that worked out? Okay, then finally the fifth one, test, survey, and analyze results to ascertain whether the new belief has been accepted. That's your assessments, but it's also surveys and questionnaires and things you wouldn't even think about, like sales figures. Sales figures can function as a test. A while back, there was something called a gay Billy doll, and it squawked, "Are you horny, baby?" the minute a child picked it up off the shelf. It was after the Austin Powers thing, that was kind of tongue-in-cheek, but nevertheless, it gave off a different message. Well,
I remember that.
If adults in particular aren't grossed out and complain to the manager about that doll, and there's more sales than there are complaints, that's success. You've won that round. But if there's more complaints than there are sales, then you've lost that round. The same with your assessments. See how it's working?
Mm-hmm.
That's
so
why
clever.
this is subtle. You really have to study this stuff.
Uh-huh. It's quite amazing when you get through it. And of course, once they get through with the child, the behavior leads to anything but parental respect and everything else. So once they're through with all of that, that child, they would have no qualms reporting. The parents doing whatever.
The child is so confused by that time because there's been no benchmarks. Right. First of all, the subtle thing that you have said to the child is there's no longer any benchmarks. You're for yourself. And they call that self-determination, which it's not. Thomas Jefferson never thought that self-determination meant that there are no morals. John Adams said that the Constitution was meant for a religious nation and no other, and it wouldn't work any other way. So, he wrote that down, but we've forgotten about that. So what's happened is the child is confused, and then he, as the psychologists say, act out or misbehave because they are confused, plus they can't follow a logical train of thought because they haven't been made to do so. They are literally unable to follow a logical train of thought from beginning to conclusion. They're not even taught to write a proper sentence from beginning to conclusion. So how do you expect them to think through something like global warming or hookup culture or, any of that stuff if they can't even think through the smallest
that ability
thing?
Away from them. Again, we took that ability away from them for them to rationalize, to reason, to do, because all we wanted to do was figure out their attitudes, beliefs, outlooks, worldviews, et cetera, but not to actually get in and try to understand and comprehend and go to the next step. Use your brain to go to the next step.
Right.
And we've taken all this away from them, and then we expect them to function. Well, in this new agenda, they do not expect your children to function as normal human beings like we have done in the past in our history in this nation. No, they want you to be good, manageable, collective, global, sustainable little citizens that are nothing but human capital and human resources.
That's right, human capital, that's what you're reduced to, and they want you to be amenable to change. Remember, conform to group goals, willingness to receive stimuli. Now that makes sense. In the context of those 5 steps to indoctrination, this makes total sense. They go together, they dovetail. But you have to, read all the psychological stuff. Now that I've said it that way, probably everybody listening to your show gets it. But before I said it that way, I'm not sure everybody would have, because it's intuitively obvious. That's where we are. And so what do they do with the child then that misbehaves, that is in the middle of a hookup culture and is, one person after another, and they're getting sexually transmitted diseases and everything else, and there's no stability in their lives. Their parents are divorced, or one partner after another, or just partner. You notice on television they never say the word spouse or husband or wife anymore. They say partner.
That's very true. It's partner, partner, or couple, or this, or that. The words, again, buzzwords. All these dialectic words. That, everything has changed. This doesn't mean this anymore. It's like we used to think sustainability meant, sustain something. No, now it means something totally different. Everything has been changed, and you've got to understand the Delphi techniques, visioning techniques, and the dialectic things that they're using these days to change words. And our children aren't equipped or prepared to understand any of this. And
how could they be? So what do? They drug them.
Well, and the whole point is to move us to the New World Order. I mean, this is the whole agenda and the whole goal, and your children are just going to become little global, manageable, sustainable citizens. They're going to be no different pretty much than China or Russia. As a matter of fact, we got a lot of this from the Russia-Soviet education.
Exactly. In fact, Stalin really was the consummate person that was the way shower of the how-to on a lot of what I've been saying. And there's a really good book that is it's nonfiction, but it's biographical. And he does not have any kind of conservative, liberal, or any other political agenda. And it's Simon Sebag Montefiore, Montefiore. He wrote Young Stalin and Stalin, the Court of the Red Tsar. Everyone should read those two books, and believe it or not, for a nonfiction book that's biographical like that, you'd think it was dry, but it is a page-turner. Both of them are page-turners. And you see the how-to and how he did it himself. I mean, the guy... And most people don't know, for instance, that Stalin was a wonderful singer. He had a perfect pitch. He could have, instead of being what he became, he could have been a singer, an opera star, or any other kind of singing star, and made his fortune that way all over the world. And instead, he turned into this monstrous thing. But, I mean, he went from dinner party to dinner party to dinner party, and he was known as, he entertained. People don't know that.
But in the meantime, he was destroying the children. I mean, this is his dream was deculturalization, so you could, break things down and build up the new ideals, ideology. That's a utopia, new order.
Yep. That's exactly what he did instead, and he chose to do that. He didn't have to. He could have made his money and fortune and fame a completely different way, and he chose that way. But that was of more interest to him, apparently. So, we got a lot of this from Stalin, but it shows exactly how he did it. And, he started out with bank robbery, and getting his friends to join him as a kid. 17,
I'm telling you, we had to. Go ahead, Beverly.
I'm sorry?
Go ahead, sweetie. I'm sorry.
That's okay. 16, 17, and 18 years old, he started out with bank robberies and getting his friends to join him.
Now, what happened to him, Beverly? Did this happen through the education system?
No. The Soviet Union, or actually the Tsarist Russia at that time, was in the state of flux. The Tsars, of course, were very cruel. And it was never a good society to begin with. They did believe in torture and regimentation, and everybody was a serf, or they were in not just a nobleman like in England, but they were either in the upper echelon or they were ground underfoot and poor. So it was a terrible environment, and he had a drunken father who beat him, mother who beat him as well, actually, and he balked, was sent to Siberia. He had this charismatic personality, though, and everybody that he would meet, that they kept him alive because he had this charismatic personality, and then he discovered, or other people discovered he could sing. He was sent to seminary by his mother because that was the only outlet for boys that were intelligent, and apparently he was extremely intelligent, to get an education, was to go to seminary. Well, he became an atheist in seminary because he was beaten by the priest there, because the whole society was turned topsy-turvy. It wasn't the Christian church. That society was it was a horrible society under the czars. So one thing led to another, and he was probably traumatized, and then he turned into a monster himself.
Well, he certainly did share of damage, and what we need to do now as we come sort of to the end of our show, Beverly, is to share with the parents and the listeners some of the solutions that we need to. I mean, Operation Jericho Project is all about solutions and alternatives to government education. But what do you see, Beverly, as some of these solutions that we need to share with the parents and listeners?
Well, what we need to do, and I should say conservatives need to do, the government school has become totally corrupted, and actually some private schools have too at this point. I mean, including a few that I know about personally, very up close and personal. And we need to have, and the Catholic Church here in America did this very well, to franchise schools. Mm-hmm. We've got a window of opportunity here. Instead of throwing all this money at campaigns, political campaigns that, let's face it, are going nowhere at this point because it's gone too far. The bad stuff's gone too far. We need to get kids out of these schools because the society isn't going to change as long as we are turning out little socialists and communists. I mean, Marxists or whatever you want to call them. You're not going to change the society unless you get that part stopped. You're not going to change the criminality and the gangs unless you get that stopped. I mean, they're learning this in school. So you've got to start.
I'm sorry,
you've got to start offering new schools.
Yeah, it's true, Beverly. That's what we have to do. But I was just saying in this scheme, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, it's not charter schools. We want everyone to understand.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that part. I think we got a little on the phone, got a little bit confused here.
So go ahead and expand on that, Beverly.
Okay, the charter schools are still accepting federal funds, and some of them are actually not doing that well, and they're not turning out the kind of they're better than nothing. Okay, but that's it. There's still, if you've got federal money going into federal curriculum in all the schools and federal assessments, and you're collecting data and data mining kids every which way from Sunday, you're not getting the job done. So what we've got to do, and we've got a very short window of opportunity that we're able to do it legally because they're going to shut it all down and make everybody toe the line, is to have as many schools out there, private schools, as possible. And one way you can do that is to franchise them. Once you get Montessori did it. I mean, you can love it or hate it. I don't care. But it's possible to do it. The Catholic Church essentially has done that, and it has franchised its schools so that when you say Catholic school, parochial school, that it belongs to the Catholic Church. And there's other online ones that have done that too. Various societies have done that. The American, what used to be called American Opinion stores have done that. And they have gotten conservative. Some of the military schools have virtually franchised themselves, but not very much. So what we need to do is have these benefactors start, instead of getting the benefactors that have a lot of money.
We're not talking about
they're doing
we're not
work.
talking about
Get them
corporations
to
or corporate
do schools.
Right.
That's where it's at. If we don't get these kids into schools that are worthwhile, then we're going to have more of the same.
That's right. We can't have the corporations. In other words, this marriage between the government and the corporate America and corporate globalism, that's basically fascism, and we cannot have that. That's not what Beverly's talking about. She's talking about private. That you can get some businesses together, some local businesses that would sponsor, a school or something. It doesn't take that much in your areas. Pastors, leaders, businesses, communities, parents, women's groups. Start a homeschooling movement. There's so many ways that we can do this if we can just get our kids out of this system.
Yeah,
and
that's exactly it. All the people that have money of one kind or another, some are private benefactors, some are just a couple of people that have gone in with business, but they're conservative business. Hobby Lobby, for example, gosh, look at the beating they're taking. But instead of backing political candidates, which at this point is useless.
Right.
Back schools and create schools and hire the teachers that are like-minded and get these kids out of these public schools and even some of the private ones, offer some more, some changes, offer, something different. And
go back. Classical education. Go back to where we actually educated our children. Go back to the biblical teaching. Teaching the Bible. This was actually printed by Congress. The very first Bible in the United States was printed by Congress to be taught in the schools. Let's go back to our classical education.
Well, and you do this very cleverly too. I mean, we are in the climate we're in. Let's face it, in this nation. You could offer several different types of schooling. You could offer a structured environment. You could offer a more creative environment for those kids that do well in that sort of thing, more unstructured because they're creative. You could offer something else. You could offer 3 different types of schooling and allow the kids to, or parents, I should say, to choose which one they want, all under the same benefactors, but the difference would be they would not be involved with government.
Exactly.
And that gives you some element of control, at least for the patriotism and at least for the vision of the Founding Fathers. You could keep that steady through all of them. And if we could just think outside the box a little bit here.
Exactly, Beverly. That's what I keep telling everybody. We got to come out of the box, and yes, there's their agenda, but we got to go around that and get more clever than they are, and just so that's what we have to do. Beat them at their own game. Exactly. Angela, do you have some input? You've been so quiet. I know you fell off, so we're glad to have you back.
The thing that we have to remember is that time is short, parents. You cannot for 1 minute think that your child's school is okay, because everything that Beverly talked about here today, you go do your research. You go ask the questions, then you'll find out that your child is experiencing the exact thing that Beverly is describing. Take time to ask your child these questions, and then come to the conclusion that, as Beverly has said, we have got to get these children out of these schools. We will not break the hold of the government education system legislatively, so just stop it. Stop fighting. There are too many laws in place right now, like, for instance, in Georgia, starting the next school year, legally, laws have been passed that a career pathway is going to be assigned to your child starting in kindergarten. And it's not going to be you, the parent, choosing this career pathway. It's going to be our government assessing your child on all of these belief systems and values that Beverly has explained and determining what career pathway your child should be on. Then we have the mandates for computerized online learning. We see this train rolling in very, very quickly. To get your child, we want to eliminate the sage on the stage. That's the talking points they're using, and that's our classroom teacher who has some morals and values. We want to get all of those teachers out of the classroom, put your child on a computer to learn everything online, where you as a parent will have no idea what your child is learning. You will have no teacher to go to ask the questions. And we see this rolling quickly. There are laws in place right now mandating that your child take some of their coursework online, and you will see this evolving to mandatory for all the coursework online as school budgets are cut because the federal government cuts funding, the state government cuts the funding, so your local school districts will be enticed to get rid of those teachers, bring in some computers from technology grants coming from your federal government to get these kids on computers. So don't waste any time.
It's called interactive learning. That's the buzzword. But there is one little wrinkle here that we could sneak into here. If you choose a classical online education for your child, you can choose that, and then you can get in there and with your child sit down and see what he's seeing. But it's not going to last long. That's the thing. And here's how they're going to get you. Accreditation. The ones that are decent and the ones that are patriotic and, have the values of the Founding Fathers and so on and so forth are going to be declared not valid because you can't get accreditation into college. So if you can't get accreditation for the school, then it will be null and void, and the parents are going to end up saying, well, if they can't get into college that way, if I can't get him into a decent college, then he's not going to have a good job, which is probably true. So we've got a very narrow window of opportunity even there, but we do have one. We can start a bunch of online schools as well as do it the other way. But I'm telling you,
college.
5 years. I'm sorry?
There are college courses online. Your college education is online now. So more and more this is happening. We can just throw out Liberty University right now, has all of their stuff online. You can go to college online. So I say to parents, don't worry about the fact that it won't be accredited to go to these colleges. Who wants to send your kids to these colleges today anyway? My God, they're indoctrinated with the liberalism and the socialism and the Marxism and all the isms and Islam, and everything else is taking over the minds of our children in colleges. You talk about an indoctrination system, so why would you want to put your child there, especially Christian parents?
Well, you're absolutely right. But the reason a lot of parents figure is if it's not accredited, that the child won't be able to get a job unless he's graduated from. That's what they're worried about. So the buzzword you need to get around is strictly interactive, closed-loop learning. A closed loop means it's a closed loop between the child and the computer, and the parent can't get in. If it's not a closed loop and the parent can get in, that's different. But it's not going to stay that way very long.
Well, that's right, Beverly, because when I talk about mandated laws to mandate online learning, these are online courses the state has approved, and these are Common Core aligned. It's the same stuff that's in the classroom. When we have online learning that the parent chooses, such as our Freedom Project Education, that is linked on our website under alternatives, this is good because this is a course parents can choose and they can interact with their child. They're not closed out of it. So that is the difference in online learning. And we can create more of those.
We can. We've got a window of opportunity. This net neutrality thing, of course, is coming in, and, of course, they call it all. That sounds so Marxist. I mean, net neutrality sounds like the People's Republic of, It's not anything like the People's Republic of anything. The people have nothing to do with it. Well, neither is this other stuff. I mean, the average person has nothing to do with it. So what you have to do is figure out what the buzzwords are, avoid that, and then try to take advantage of this window of opportunity, and more than anything, get these people that want to run for public office or have a lot of independent, wealthy benefactors and so on that are trying to work with think tanks and so on like that, but they're not doing anything. They're sending out, like a Heritage Foundation and so on. There's many foundations like that are conservative sort of, but what they're doing is sending out surveys that they already know to how people are going to answer, because they're only sending it to potential donors who subscribe to things like the Washington Times or the or some conservative.
Target.
Yeah, and so they know what the answer is going to be, and they don't even care how you answer. They throw it in the trash and send you then a donation letter. Will you please support us? That's not going to work. We can't work that way anymore. We need to send these kids to good schools. Instead, throw your money into really good schools.
You know, Beverly, unfortunately, organizations like the Heritage and even Hillsdale College now is sold out to the charter system because of all the money that's going to be made with this marriage between the government and the corporations. So
they know that, and I mean they've already kind of gotten caught on Heritage. I know on Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and a lot of them didn't realize that if they just took a little bit of this money, like from they thought Carnegie Foundation was okay, and originally, and they didn't realize some of these. I'm not just targeting Heritage, but any of these. Many people took money from people, organizations like that have been standbys and household name type.
Right.
But they thought they could take just a little. But pretty soon they were dependent on that little.
Right. It's called greed.
And now can't say anything against them.
No, I know. So it's pretty sad. Well, listeners, we've sort of come to the end of our show today, unfortunately. We could spend hours and hours with Beverly. She's such a wealth of knowledge. And Beverly, would you like to say a few last words to the listeners?
Oh, certainly. I really hope that all of my listeners will get the understanding that education is the most important thing. That has been the drawback all these years, and what has put us where we are today with a president like what we have now, and put us on the path where we almost can't get out. It's through education. We've got to get them out of and change this educational system back to classical values and classical education, and and stop all the politicization, so that we can have a country that is exceptional the way the founding fathers envisioned it.
Amen.
So I just I would like to say that I hope all of the listeners today will take this to heart and not believe that just voting for a Republican or an independent for a school board representative is going to cut it, because it isn't.
No, it is not. And Beverly, will you tell the listeners how they can get in touch with you if they want to know more?
Sure. It's Beverly Eakman, and it's my website is beverlyeakman.com, but it's BeverlyEakman.com. So and there is a little. There's several tabs, but one of them is a contact, and they can just click on the contact and send me an email.
And I would encourage the listeners to go to Beverly's website and listen to more of her interviews and her material, and get some of her books. Pushback and Cloning of the American Mind, the updated version, will be out soon, so you don't want to miss those. Angela, do you have some closing words for the listeners today?
So, well, just one last reminder that our listeners visit our website, OperationJerichoProject.com. And when you click on the Educators Speak Out tab, you will find Beverly listed there with some of my favorite education whistleblowers and links directly to her website and some of her interviews as well. And so we just invite you to go to our website and learn more, and also check out OJP Radio at the top of our webpage for next week's radio show.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. Your work is so important, and it was a pleasure to be on it.
Well, Beverly, we enjoyed you so much, and we thank you for coming on, and we hope you'll join us again.
Surely. You take care now. God bless
you. God bless.
And goodbye, listeners.
Listeners, I'd just like to remind you that next week we're going to have Joel McDermott on, and he's another author and lecturer and has a lot to say about charters and homeschooling, et cetera, et cetera. So we want to give you as much information as we possibly can, and it's real important that you understand. We're trying to give you the reasons why you need to get your children out, and then give you the options and the alternatives to get them out, because that's really what Operation Jericho Project is about, and Operation Jericho Project Radio. So we thank you again for joining us. We'll see you next week, and God bless to all, and until next week. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.